Good evening, ladies and gentlemen of the radio audience.
Station WOR, L. Bamberger and Company at Newark, New Jersey.
This is WAAM, 1 Bond Street, Newark, New Jersey.
This program has come to you through the National Broadcasting Company and associated radio stations. This is WJZ in New York.
This is WEEI in Boston.
Westinghouse, KYW, the Chicago Herald and Examiner Station.
This is KHJ, the Don Lee Station, Los Angeles.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Radio Journeys. I'm John Grimmett, your guide each week as we go back and listen to the earliest days of radio. Now, these ragged sounds, a spark gap transmitter, are not exactly the usual way that we begin our radio journeys each week, but you see, out of these sounds emerges this. This Christmas Eve, 2006, is also the 100th anniversary of one of the most important events in the history of radio and broadcasting. It is the 100th anniversary of the first voice radio broadcast. Yes, December 24, 1906, the very first voice radio broadcast. This particular Christmas Eve should also belong to the man who made this first broadcast, Reginald Fessenden.
Good evening. This is Professor Reginald A. Fessenden speaking to you from Brant Rock, Massachusetts, at the tower of the National Electric Signaling Company.
This Christmas Eve on Radio Journeys, we're also then commemorating Reginald Fessenden's achievement, as well as his other achievements in radio. His is a story of disappointment and betrayal. Somehow, for many years, Reginald Fessenden was forgotten by radio historians and the broadcasting industry, and only recently has his record been reconsidered. We'll talk this week on the podcast with Professor John Belrose, who has devoted much of his career to studying the work of Reginald Fessenden, and who has simulated some of Reginald Fessenden's earliest broadcasts and transmissions of voice, right down to the last technical detail. But first, some background. Reginald Fessenden has been credited with at least a half dozen of the most major inventions in early radio. He was born and raised in Canada, but did most of his radio work in the United States, especially from a station at Brant Rock, Massachusetts. Now, Brant Rock was a ship-to-shore station with a call sign of BO, Bravo Ocean, and like all stations in those days, transmissions were made in Morse code using spark gap transmitters. But it was from Brant Rock where Fessenden was able to begin refining the technology that would lead to voice transmissions. In 1900, he transmitted the first voice transmissions, highly experimental and not very successful, but they were the beginning. He invented the first method for the continuous wave transmission. Continuous wave is simply a constant wave rather than the intermittent bursts of a spark gap transmitter. And that was what allowed the efficient and successful transmission of voice and music. And so it was that on December 24, 1906, he was able to broadcast for as long as 1 hour, with a special message for Christmas to boats off the Atlantic coast. not far off the Atlantic coast, mind you. But these were boats primarily of the U.S. Navy and of the United Fruit Company, which had been outfitted with special receivers that Fessenden had built, and he repeated that broadcast on December 31, 1906 as well. He also invented the forerunner to the modern radio receiver, the heterodyne receiver, which allowed for greater stability of frequency tuning. These are just some of the many achievements that Reginald Fessenden accomplished during his career in radio. Now, given the number and scope of these accomplishments, you'd have every right to ask, why haven't we heard his name? Everybody knows about Marconi, Lee DeForest, the two people who are usually considered most responsible for broadcasting as we have it today. Marconi inventing basic radio technology and DeForest taking it to the level where it could be used for broadcasting. But between these two men lies Fessenden, and for many reasons, Marconi and DeForest stole the limelight. Recently, however, there have been some doubts about Marconi particularly. Now, Marconi, of course, did indeed develop spark gap technology, which he in turn developed from the work of another Italian, Augusto Righi. Between 1896 and 1901, Marconi was trying to transmit further and further with spark gap. The transmissions at first were very short, a matter of just a few miles. But Marconi became an icon when, in December of 1901, he announced that he had personally received a Morse code message transmitted from Cornwall in England, and that he had received it at Signal Hill, a high spot in St. John's, Newfoundland. This was to be considered for many years the first transatlantic radio transmission. Now, Marconi was indeed highly regarded and respected for his work, and so very few people actually questioned him much at the time, although there was some skepticism. Today, the skepticism is rising about Marconi's claims. Given what we know today about propagation of radio waves, many people say there's simply no way that Marconi could ever have heard that signal across the Atlantic at that time of day and under those conditions. Some have even gone so far as to say that he heard what he wanted to hear, a very faint letter S sent repeatedly, emerging from all the radio noise. Actually, what he may have really heard was just radio noise. Now, with all of this in mind, a lot of radio historians are now beginning to question whether Marconi deserves quite the status that he's achieved as being the father of radio, and Reginald Fessenden is beginning to emerge as a contender for the title. Now, as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, I spoke earlier this week with John Belrose, Professor Emeritus and Director Emeritus of Radio Science at the Communications Research Center in Ottawa, Ontario. Now, during this interview, Professor Belrose spoke at great length about the many accomplishments of Fessenden, demonstrating just how significant Fessenden was to the history of radio and to broadcasting as we know it today. During the interview, we'll also hear the two simulations, technical simulations really, attempts to recreate how Fessenden actually used the technology of 1900 and 1906, and in the end coming up with a nearly perfectly authentic recreation of those original transmissions. But our conversation started with Professor Belrose telling me how he became interested in working with Fessenden. Actually, it all began when he was pursuing his doctorate at Cambridge University, reading about Marconi's achievements and wondering whether Fessenden, a fellow Canadian, actually achieved much more. But it was while studying and doing research at Cambridge University that he began to have doubts about Marconi.
As a result of my study, I realized that Marconi could have heard absolutely nothing on Signal Hill. I mean, the time of the day that he tried to transmit across the Atlantic would have been just impossible. The signals would have been too weak. And this started me thinking about it. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the technology that Marconi was using has nothing to do with the technology that we're using today. Whereas I got a copy of a couple of books on Fessenden, and I realized that what Fessenden was doing is more or less, we do it better nowadays, but the technology is the same. And so I was studying this off and on throughout the period of about mid-70s to late 80s. Well, in the beginning of 1990, McMaster University were holding annual Alexander Graham Bell lectures, and they invited me to present the 15th annual Alexander Graham Bell lecture in 1992. So as a result, I started putting pen to paper, and I thought we should not only understand what Fessenden did, but maybe try and simulate his first words without wires, and that's what got me building a spark transmitter, which we did a lot of experimentation with.
So actually, it sounds to me that you think Fessenden's work actually was more important than Marconi's.
We have to give Marconi credit for what he did. He was using a very simplified technology, and if you look at the kind of systems he was using right up to the mid-1905, 1906, even right up to 1910, he was using a very primitive technology, spark gap transmitters. Certainly in 1906, when Fessenden was using his high-frequency alternator and using CW waves, Marconi stuck with spark. He thought spark was good enough for him. So from the point of view of who is the principal pioneer of radio as we know it today, that was not Marconi. But Marconi had the world before him because he had money. And he installed coast stations all around the world, and many ships in the early days were using Marconi equipment, and so he provided shore to sea and sea to shore communications, and this caught the attention of the world. And the world has always thought that Marconi is the father of radio, and our textbooks tell us so.
Right.
And almost nobody heard of Fessenden.
Let's talk a little bit about that simulation of the voice transmission of 1900. When did you actually record that simulation of the 1900 point-to-point transmission, that first voice transmission?
We recorded it in time for this lecture, but it was put up on the web in about 1995. Well, from the point of view of authenticity, it's exactly what Fessenden did. It's a spark gap transmitter operating at 10,000 sparks a second. With a carbon microphone inserted in series with, in our case, a simulated antenna rather than a real antenna. So it's exactly what he did. Two comments about authenticity of the thing. We didn't try to duplicate the detector that he used in his receiver. So our transmitter was a simulation exactly. Our receiver, we didn't try to simulate the kind of receiver he used.
And Fessenden was speaking to his assistant, a man named Mr. Thiessen, who was about a mile away. Is that right?
That's right, yes.
Okay, and he had this detector about a mile away, Mr. Thiessen.
That's right. They had communication link, telegraphy from the remote station back to where Fessenden was, and Fessenden trying to transmit by voice to the remote receiver.
Let's listen to Dr. Belrose's simulation of this 1900 voice transmission now. You'll hear how noisy and really unusable this early attempt was.
1, 2, 3, 4. It's snowing where you are, Mr. Beasley. If it is, telegraph back and let me know.
Professor Belrose, can you remember exactly what that message was?
Not word for word.
It was 1, 2, 3, 4. Hello, is it snowing where you are, Mr. Thiessen? If it is...
Telegraph back and let me know, yes.
That's right. That's what it was.
Those are more like the words, yes.
Well, it must have been challenging to reconstruct that transmission and to get any voice at all out of there. What was the hardest part of doing that?
Well, he had two problems. One is he didn't really have a suitable detector for continuous waves, and secondly, he didn't really have a continuous wave transmitter. He had a spark transmitter inherent with the noise of the spark, but he upped the spark rate to such a high rate that it sort of simulated a continuous wave transmitter.
Right. Extremely rapid intermittent bursts.
You have to sort of understand a little bit about spark transmitters to follow what I'm going to tell you. His 1900 transmitter had a mechanical interrupter to produce the 10,000 sparks per second. This high-frequency alternator, not all that high, but it would produce 10 kilohertz. He could use the output of that alternator to provide the voltage for his spark transmitter.
So in the end, that spark gap transmission method, would not be very useful at all for voice transmission, and it sounds like he abandoned it looking for another method.
Well, he knew from the beginning what he wanted. He wanted a high-frequency alternator. A quick resume of developments. In 1900, General Electric were requested by Fessenden to build such an alternator. In 1902, they delivered their best alternator when he was on Roanoke Island, and it operated only at a frequency of 10 kilohertz. He had to radiate anything, since he had a relatively electrically small antenna. He needed frequencies much, much higher. He wanted frequencies about 80 to 100 kilohertz. In 1906, they delivered their best alternator. What did their best alternator do? Nothing that the earlier ones. Maybe it looked nicer, I don't know. But 10 kilohertz was the highest frequency that they could get out of it. So Fessenden took it upon himself to tear the thing to bits and rebuild it. And he must have worked day and night, because he didn't get that alternator until September of 1906. By early November, he had an alternator working at a frequency of 80 kilohertz, developing an output power of a little bit less than a kilowatt. And that's what he used for his Christmas Eve broadcasts. That's what he used for other voice transmissions, which he made in that time frame.
And this alternator that he used in late 1906 was generating a continuous wave.
That's right, yes. Well, an alternator is a device that produces an oscillating waveform. This alternator was operating at a frequency of 80,000 cycles per second, 80 kilohertz. But it's just very, very difficult to produce a machine which will operate at such a high frequency. We had to drive our little electromechanical device at 14,400 revolutions per minute, which is an incredibly high speed.
And he did the same thing, I presume.
He had to do the same thing. He was driving his alternator at about the same precision.
Well, listen to that simulation that you recorded in just a moment. You used an excerpt from a movie about Fessenden in this simulation.
Oh, yes. What we play back starts out with my voice. And then I took snippets from a CBC film about Fessenden, a television program broadcast in 1979. The Forgotten Genius, I think it was.
And let's listen to that simulation now, using the technology that Fessenden used. First, you'll hear Professor Belrose's voice, and then the excerpt from the movie.
Calling CQ to all ships. This is Station BO, Bravo Ocean, at Brant Rock. Listen, you are about to hear a special transmission for Christmas Eve.
That was a phonograph recording of Handel's Largo. We will now have a solo sung by one of our engineers, Mr. Stein, accompanied by me on the violin. I must apologize, as it appears that Mr. Stein will be unable to perform for us this evening, so those of you who are listening to this transmission will have to be content with a violin solo by Reginald Fessenden. I would like to end this transmission with those inspiring words from the Bible. Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace to men of good will. We will be transmitting again 1 week from tonight on New Year's Eve. In the meantime, Merry Christmas, everyone.
Professor Belrose, that sounds like Orson Welles playing Fessenden there. Do you know who was playing in that movie?
No, I know. It's a CBC film. It certainly isn't Orson Welles.
Yeah. sounded uncannily like
I don't
him.
know. I don't know who the broadcaster was. It's a CBC Shell Oil Company 1979 drama on Fessenden.
Right.
The drama was one of a series entitled The Winners, and the particular drama was entitled The Forgotten Genius.
How close do you think you came to the actual sound and characteristics of that Christmas Eve broadcast?
Well, as far as I'm concerned, it's probably jolly good. I mean, the only difference is that he was working his transmitter into a real antenna, and we were working our transmitter into a simulated antenna. And so the bandwidths of the two systems might not be the same. But the carbon microphone is in series with the antenna. And so low-frequency antennas tend to be relatively narrow band, but you insert a carbon microphone in series with that antenna, and you broaden the bandwidth. So I think our bandwidth was probably not unlike the bandwidth that was actually transmitted. And he had a good detector in those days. So we've done exactly what he did, and I think the sound that we hear is probably more or less like the sound that was heard in 1906.
Very good. Who else worked with you on that project? On both of these simulations, actually?
Peter Bullion, who's a technologist working for the Communications Research Center. He put together the apparatus that we used.
You made a point earlier in the interview that Fessenden has not been recognized until very recently. He's been pretty much forgotten. Of course, most people think of Lee DeForest as being the father of broadcasting. They say that he made the first broadcast from New York City in about 1907 or so. Why do you think Fessenden became so unknown?
Well, Lee DeForest was a promoter like Marconi, and he was competing with Fessenden. In fact, a lot of the early receivers in the 1906 period and prior to that were exact copies using Fessenden's electrolytic detector in the receiver, which he just took and manufactured. In fact, Fessenden spent his life in litigation of defending his patents. Everybody was taking his patents from him.
Right.
The trouble with Fessenden is that he was at home in his laboratory, but he wasn't really suited to the business side of inventing, and also dealing with the financiers that were providing the funding for his work. He was out of his element in doing that. And what he was doing was entirely not understood by the world, and the world really couldn't care less. Spark was the way to go. Marconi was Spark, and so if you were sending wireless, you had to be using Spark. Fessenden was talking about continuous waves. When he published in 1902 his concept of taking a high-frequency alternator to generate radio frequency signals and modulating it by putting a carbon microphone in series with the antenna, Fleming, who had worked earlier with Marconi, wrote his book on wireless, which was published in 1906. And this book said that there was no way that Fessenden could produce radio frequency radiation by what he was talking about doing. Well, when his book was published, Fessenden was busy doing exactly that with the high-frequency alternator and transmitting radio frequency waves, sending tones, voice, and music. So nobody understood what he was doing. I don't know. It's hard to understand how he received so little credit. In 1906, he was using synchronous Spark transmitter. So in other words, it was a Spark transmitter better than Marconi was using in that time frame. And he established communications between Brant Rock in Massachusetts and Machrihanish in Scotland in January 1902. Two-way, back and forth. In other words, the operator at one end would send a telegraphy message with his key, and the operator at Brant Rock would receive or at the other location would receive the message and reply back immediately. Marconi in that time frame was one way. In other words, he would send a message and he would have no idea whether the message was received or not. He would have to wait for a cable to come back and say, yes, we copied it, okay. Well, that's not really communications. The press didn't understand that. In the press in those days, they wrote that what Fessenden had done was not an accomplishment because he wasn't providing a service. Marconi was struggling to provide a service. Fessenden was struggling to improve the technology. And so they said what he had done was he had accomplished nothing. And they showed in cartoons dot and dash icons of Marconi's leaping across the Atlantic with great glee. And Fessenden's dot and dash icons were struggling to climb to the top of his 420-foot tower, falling off the tower into the ocean in front. Well, heck, he was ridiculed by radio pioneers in the time in which he was doing his work, and he was ridiculed by the media. The press just couldn't believe in 1906 when he made his broadcasts.
Right.
They just couldn't believe that he had done what he had done.
Yeah.
If he had told them what he had done, that he'd made his Christmas Eve broadcast, they wouldn't have believed him. In fact, in mid-November, or the latter part of November, he told the press about one of his experiments, the first practical use of wireless telephony.
Mm-hmm.
He had fitted a fishing boat with one of his sets, and the fishing boat was in communications with Brant Rock. The fishing boat was only about 10 miles offshore. The fisherman put the wireless to practical use. He said he was bringing his fish in, and he wanted to know the price of fish. So the operator at Brant Rock, this was voice-to-voice communications. The operator at Brant Rock phoned up Boston, got the price of fish, and told the captain of the fish boat what the price of fish was on that day. And what did the press do? They reported the story very briefly in a little paragraph and said, "This is another fishy story."
They just didn't believe it had happened.
No.
Yeah, that's amazing. Fessenden also invented the first heterodyne receiver. Is that right?
That's right. He invented the methodology of heterodyne. The heterodyne principle is probably his most important invention, really, because heterodyning is used in every single receiver that we have in the world.
Mm-hmm.
You receive the radio frequency signal, you heterodyne it down to an intermediate frequency, and you do the amplification at the intermediate frequency rather than at the radio frequency.
Mm-hmm.
And then you detect what comes out of your receiver. In other words, the super heterodyne receiver, which was developed by Armstrong, uses Fessenden's heterodyne principle, heterodyne methodology. But he thought of this in 1902. Well, there was no way he could build a receiver to do that. The concept came to him, and he patented the concept. It really couldn't come into effect until we had vacuum tube oscillators, which was in about 1913. So it was a decade ahead of its time.
Mm-hmm. Would you say, though, that modern broadcast technology as we have it today descended from Fessenden's early experiments?
Well, we do it better nowadays, but it's exactly the same. We use CW waves, modulate the CW wave. In the medium frequency band, the modulation is largely amplitude modulation, just exactly like Fessenden did.
Mm-hmm.
And the detector is the same kind of a detector that we use nowadays in principle. Well, let me finish right at the end here.
Sure.
Going through what Fessenden did. If you ask who invented radio, no one pioneer can be said to be the inventor or the father of radio. All we can do is give credit where credit is due. But if we ask specific questions, who was the first to use the word and method of continuous waves? Fessenden did that in 1897. Mm-hmm. Who was the first to transmit voice over radio? Fessenden did that in December 1900. Who devised a detector for continuous waves? Fessenden achieved that in 1902. Who was the first to use the word and the method of heterodyne? Fessenden did that in 1902. Who was the first to send two-way transatlantic wireless telegraphy messages? Fessenden did that on the 10th of January 1906, and the first to record the night-to-day variation of wireless transmission propagation studies. Who was the first to send wireless telephony, voice across the Atlantic? In about mid-November 1906, Fessenden did that. Who was the first to demonstrate wireless telegraphy in practical use, ship to shore and shore to ship, between Brant Rock and a small fishing vessel equipped with a wireless telephone set? Fessenden did that on the 3rd of November 1906. Who was the first to discover evidence for long path propagation? In other words, signals going not the short path between the transmitter and the receiver, but around the other way around. Fessenden reported that he did that in 1906. He was laughed at. No one believed that. Who was the first to demonstrate wireless transmission in conjunction with wire lines? In other words, telephone to telephone via radio. Fessenden did that on the 21st of December, 1906. And who made the first wireless broadcast, Voice and Music, on the 24th of December, 1906, and repeated on the 31st of December, 1906? Well, that was Reginald Aubrey Fessenden. In other words, Fessenden did all those things. Well, what you say about Marconi? Marconi was spark telegraphy in that time period. And his accomplishments were that he had stations all over the world, but they were wireless telegraphy, and they were employing spark, which has nothing to do with what we do nowadays. So Fessenden is clearly the pioneer of radio technology as we know it today, and he is the father of AM radio.
Wow. Yes. Thank you very much, Professor Belrose. Outstanding.
All right.
Thank you very
Bye-bye
much.
for now. Thanks for the chat.
Now, in addition to that telephone conversation, Professor Belrose and I communicated by email, in which he told me that there is indeed some lingering controversy about the achievements of Fessenden. While most historians who study the work of Fessenden do agree that Fessenden did actually make this broadcast on Christmas Eve of 1906, there are still a few historians out there who don't agree or aren't sure. One of the best known of these to radio collectors is Donna Halper, who doesn't dispute that Fessenden was in fact the first one to do a voice broadcast, but doubts that it was actually done on Christmas Eve of 1906. She believes it was probably done much earlier, and that in fact Fessenden had been experimenting with voice broadcasting on several occasions during 1905 and 1906. One notable voice of dissent in this debate is James O'Neill, who actually doubts that anything ever took place, that Fessenden never made the first broadcast. He just can't find enough evidence for it, he says. But most researchers who are devoted to working with Fessenden's legacy say that there is enough evidence to substantiate the Christmas Eve broadcast, as well as possibly earlier broadcasts. Fessenden himself said so, and even in the early 1920s, some radio historians of the day acknowledged that Fessenden had carried out the first voice broadcasts sometime in 1905 or 1906. There's even a letter written by Lee DeForest, one of Fessenden's greatest rivals, and the one who is most often conventionally credited with making the first voice broadcasts, and he says that Fessenden did it before him. Very interesting, these debates that go on among radio historians even today. And of course, what would be the greatest evidence if it did exist? Well, an actual recording of that broadcast made on the day. No such recording, as far as we can tell, was ever made, although the technology was in place at that time to do so. And well, for those of us who do lament the lack of such a recording, we do have John Belrose and Derek Gunn to thank. Professor Belrose for his technological demonstration, and Derek Gunn for trying to simulate the content and feel of that Christmas Eve 1906 broadcast. And that brings us back to that bit of ragged spark gap radio that we heard at the beginning of the broadcast tonight. I thought we should return to it, because it is also a very historically significant recording. You see, that broadcast from 1910, and yes, it was a broadcast, is so far the earliest known recording of a radio transmission, and there's quite a story behind it. You see, on July 4 of 1910, the date that broadcast was most likely recorded, there was a very noteworthy boxing match between Jack Johnson, the first African-American heavyweight boxing champion, and Joe Jeffries, a white boxing champion that he had defeated a couple of years before. And this Morse code broadcast was a commentary about that boxing match. Most likely it was broadcast by a station in San Francisco to ships along the west coast of North America. Now, in 1910, of course, radio was still quite young, but by 1910, radio telegraphy had become the norm. Now, those of you who are very expert in Morse code may very well understand this message. You see, it was not written in international Morse code used by amateur radio today. It was transmitted in railroad or American Morse code, similar in many ways, but also different in others. Now, if you'll let me indulge your ears for just a moment, as well as your patience, I'm going to play the entire recording. It runs for about 2 minutes and 45 seconds. Give any listeners out there the chance to hear the whole thing and possibly analyze it if you know Morse code. And those of you who love radio and the sounds of radio, well, you'll get your fill of Spark Gap Radio as it sounded in 1910. And afterwards, I'll tell you exactly what the commentary says. Let's listen. From July 4, 1910, the earliest known radio aircheck. A bit of radio telegraphy is transmitted from station TG in San Francisco to ships along the West Coast. Here's what the message said. Again, it was about that big boxing match which was to happen that day. It said, Joe Jeffries owes Jack Johnson a good deal of money. That is, he has made a fortune through his relations with the colored champion. In fact, the Californian has cleaned up $62,218.28 since November 17, all because the Negro fighter insisted that the retired champion agree to meet him in a fistic contest. Now, this recording originally appeared for the very first time in June of 2004 at tinfoil.com, which is an internet repository of old cylinder recordings. Quite a fascinating site in itself. And tinfoil.com obtained the recording from special collections at San Francisco State University. Now, even here, there may be some controversy about whether it really was a broadcast or not, an actual radio transmission. The date was arrived at strictly from the contents of that Morse code message. The date of November 17, which was mentioned in the Morse code message, would actually have been November 17, 1909, the previous fight that Jack Johnson had had with Joe Jeffries. And if one listens closely, one can hear the fading in and out that is characteristic of radio today, just as it was then. And the spark gap tone that we heard is also characteristic of radio transmitters. Major reasons to arrive at the conclusion that this was indeed a radio broadcast from station TG in San Francisco in 1910. So there you are, real radio history, the very origins, tonight on Radio Journey.
There's a great sensational wonder today, we know. Everyone is talking and fooling with radio. It's a wireless telephone, I just bought one of my own. Now I sit at home alone and hear them dish the dirt. But all that I can hear is buzzing in my ear is sounds like wildcat hisses, but it's boys and misses making silly wishes, sending wireless kisses all night through. They do that same old story ever new, and it is true. 1,000,000 girls and boys are making all that noise, for that means I love you. All that I can hear is buzzing in my ear is traveling men and females, lonesome wives and he-males, spooned by dots and dashes, making wireless mashes. All the world is filled with love tales by the score, and maybe more, but lovers far apart can't finish what they start. Station LOVE signing off. Good night.
That's just a little bit of relief for everybody who might not have been very happy about all the noise in tonight's broadcast. It was a Thomas Edison recording from 1924, the Atlantic Dance Orchestra with Arthur Hall on vocal, and the name of the song was simply Radio. Thanks to WFMU.org and Jerry Fabris of the Thomas Edison National Historic Site for making that recording available online. And by the way, if you enjoy that kind of music, you can hear it at WFMU.org and Thomas Edison's Attic, which is broadcast every alternate Tuesday over WFMU-FM in Orange, New Jersey, the home, by the way, of the Edison National Historic Site. And it's also a podcast, which you can find online at WFMU.org. Jerry Fabris is the host, and he plays recordings from Thomas Edison's original record collection. Some of those are also radio programs from the late 1920s that we featured here in the past on Radio Journeys. And just a few more notes before we go tonight. I mentioned earlier that there was more than one simulation of Fessenden's Christmas Eve broadcast. Professor Belrose's is perhaps the best known, but there's also one out there by Mr. Derek Gunn. I mentioned that briefly a few minutes ago. I tried to contact Mr. Gunn to ask him for permission to feature his simulation on the program in full, but I was not able to, and so out of courtesy, we've just featured a couple of very brief snippets from it. That voice of Professor Fessenden introducing himself at the beginning of tonight's podcast was actually Mr. Derek Gunn acting as Professor Fessenden. And then one brief snippet of a violin solo also came from Mr. Gunn's simulation. Now, if you'd like to hear the entire simulation, you can do so. It's available online at www.radiocom.net. That's radiocom.net/Fessenden. That's spelled with a capital F, Fessenden. It is ostensibly the homepage for Fessenden Station BO Bravo Ocean in Brant Rock, Massachusetts. And there you'll find an audio link for Mr. Derek Gunn's recreation of that first radio broadcast on Christmas Eve of 1906. You'll also find a link to Professor John Belrose's articles, all at radiocom.net/Fessenden. Now, the website is written and edited by Dave Riley, a well-known radio amateur with the call sign of AA1A. He's based in Marshfield, Massachusetts, nearby Brant Rock. And Mr. Riley also has links to a lot of other pages related to Fessenden and his achievements. Now, Professor Belrose's work, both of the simulations that we heard tonight on the podcast, are available at the Hammond Museum of Radio. That's Hammond Museum of Radio, one word, .org. There's a large exhibit about Fessenden located there. And, of course, thanks also to tinfoil.com, that repository of cylinder recordings, one of my very favorite sites to visit. Thanks to them for making that earliest radio telegraphy air check available online. Now, all of these recordings that we played tonight on Radio Journeys are believed to be in the public domain. And looking ahead to next week, it is New Year's Eve, and in keeping with Reginald Fessenden's tradition, we're going to do something else quite new, quite different, another first in radio broadcasting. Next week we will present the earliest known recording of a complete radio program. Some of you out there who know a lot about the history of radio may already know what program that could be. Well, if you don't, just wait. It'll be well worth waiting for the surprise, I assure you. It will be a special extended edition of Radio Journeys next week for that very special historic recording. And this week we're going to leave you with just one more thing. You know, last year on Christmas, for our special Christmas podcast, we played a recording from KHJ in Los Angeles. This was a promotional recording probably sent out to employees and clients of KHJ to thank them for their work throughout the previous year. The recording was made in 1929. Well, I thought that tonight it would be a good idea to finish out the show by playing that recording once again. It is available online still at our blog page as last year's Christmas podcast, but it's such a perfect representation of how Christmas Day might have sounded as radio stations marked Christmas Eve or Christmas Day that I wanted to play it again. And so here it is, just to finish out tonight's podcast and to say very Merry Christmas to all of you out there, from Radio Journeys, from me, and from the Radio Nostalgia Network. Season's greetings and very many blessings to you and your family from Radio Journeys. I'll see you all back here next week for New Year's Eve. Bye-bye now.
Fall on your knees. Thank you.